What if the real threat didn't come from a scream, but from a whisper dressed up as tenderness? What if what drains us the most isn't open conflict, but the emotional manipulation hiding behind a "I did it for your own good"? There are battles that aren't fought with swords, but with loaded silences, guilt planted with surgical precision, and affections that slowly turn into cages. Not all enemies wear armor. Some show up with the smile of a martyr and the language of sacrifice. In a world where seeming vulnerable can be a tactic, and where many relationships are built on subtle games of power, protecting our energy becomes a matter of survival. And by energy, we're not talking about something mystical. We're talking about that inner force that holds our dignity together, that lets us think clearly, choose freely, and stand our ground without crumbling under someone else's guilt or emotional blackmail disguised as love. That energy doesn't get drained by real effort, but by the constant pressure to justify our boundaries to people who only respect full surrender. The scariest part is how often we don't even realize we're being drained. Because emotional manipulators don't always yell. They don't always demand. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they go silent just when you try to speak. Sometimes they suddenly need too much, right when you're barely holding it together yourself. And you, afraid of disappointing them, afraid of hurting anyone, still convinced that love always means giving in, you hand over your energy, your time, your decisions. Until one day, without knowing exactly when or how, you feel empty. No excitement, no clarity, no desire. Just a quiet, heavy fatigue that follows you even when you're alone. So how do we get to that point? How is it that so many people end up feeling responsible for someone else's emotions, trapped in emotional slavery, getting nothing in return but more demands? Maybe part of the answer lies in how we were raised emotionally. We were taught to be kind, but not wise. To give in, but not to assess. To forgive, but not to walk away. We were told love bears all things, but no one warned us about the kind of affection that poisons. And more than anything, we were taught that protecting ourselves is selfish. That saying no is cold. That leaving means betrayal. Niccolò Machiavelli, that uncomfortable thinker who's so often dismissed as cynical or cruel, actually offers a powerful compass for navigating this emotional swamp. His raw, almost surgical view of human nature wasn't meant to make us paranoid, but to remind us that power, emotional, political, symbolic, is always in play. And that those who don't understand the rules of the game end up being pawns in someone else's strategy. That not everyone around us wants our well-being. Some are just looking for ways to feed off of it. Machiavelli didn't speak in modern emotional terms. He didn't use the phrase emotional manipulation, but he talked about the strategic use of appearances, the need to earn respect before seeking love, the value of keeping your plans to yourself, and the importance of staying alert to the motives of others. In his world, power wasn't dirty, it was inevitable. And understanding emotional power, the kind that operates through silences, promises, or carefully timed gestures, might be one of the most useful things we can take from his thinking today. Because this isn't about turning ourselves into cold-hearted tacticians. It's about waking up, about becoming the kind of person who can recognize when affection starts to feel like a trap, when a relationship demands more than it gives, when someone else's emotions begin to steer our choices. Emotional manipulators don't need to yell. All they need is to make you feel guilty. They don't have to control you directly. They just need you to believe that their well-being depends on you. And you, wanting to be kind, to be present, to be fair, you fall. You hand your energy over to a bottomless pit. This is where Machiavellian thinking becomes medicine. It reminds us that protecting ourselves isn't selfish, it's smart. That setting boundaries isn't cold, it's an act of self-respect. That we don't owe anyone access to our emotions or our plans, especially those who use that access to manipulate, not to understand. That not every tear deserves comfort, and not every wound is honest. And that in many cases, the wisest thing you can do isn't to confront, but to walk away, silently and firmly. Protecting your energy isn't some trendy spiritual idea. It's not a feel-good slogan. It's emotional self-defense. And doing it with Machiavellian clarity helps us tell the difference between the pain that's worth it and the pain that's only there to break us. Between the kind of sacrifice that builds real connection and the kind that only feeds someone's ego. Between the kind of love that supports and the kind that suffocates. Maybe that's why emotional manipulation is so hard to face. Because it often comes from the people we love, or the ones we've learned to depend on, because it hides under the mask of care, concern, affection. But not everything that looks like love actually is, and not everything that hurts is worth keeping. So how do you protect yourself without turning to stone? How do you draw the line without becoming the villain? How do you get your energy back after years of holding together unbalanced relationships? Sometimes the answer isn't in your heart. It's in your strategy, in the sharp awareness of someone who's learned that true strength doesn't come from enduring everything, but from knowing where to stay, when to speak, and who deserves to hear your truth. Because in the end, your energy is the most valuable thing you have. It doesn't come back with pretty words or empty promises. It's restored through choices, through space, through distance, even coldness when necessary, through wisdom, and maybe, just maybe, through a little bit of Machiavelli, especially at the moment when you realize you're losing yourself just to avoid disappointing others. So let me ask you, how much of your energy are you still giving away to people who never truly earned it? Anyone who doesn't learn to look closely ends up living under the spell of sweet words hiding sharp intentions. Emotional manipulation rarely shows up as a direct attack. It's more of a slow burn, a carefully rehearsed performance where the other person always seems more fragile, more wounded, more in need than you. And in that theater, without even realizing it, you stop being yourself and start becoming the caretaker of someone else's emotions. A caretaker no one asked for, no one thanks, but everyone expects. Your energy begins to leak through cracks that seem small, an apology you never owed, a favor you didn't have the strength to give, a presence you offered when what you truly needed was your own. No one took it from you by force, you gave it away without knowing. Not out of weakness, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty. Because deep down, you still believed love meant enduring, that being a good person meant putting up with everything. And you didn't see that you were slowly being emptied. Machiavelli understood something most people still refuse to accept. Most human beings are not driven by noble ideals, but by convenience. Not always out of malice, sometimes just self-preservation, a thirst for power, or the need for control. And in the emotional arena, that same dynamic plays out. Even more dangerously, because it disguises itself as affection. It hides behind phrases like, "I need you," "I don't know what I'd do without you," "You're the only one who gets me." And you fall for it, not because you're naive, but because you want to be fair. But how fair is it to yourself to let someone drain you until there's nothing left? Emotional manipulators rarely come at you with obvious aggression. Their approach is more refined. They make you feel essential and also responsible. They convince you that without you, they'll fall apart, but with you, they still suffer. It's a perfectly crafted trap to keep you feeling never good enough, never free enough to walk away. Every time you try to draw a boundary, the response isn't outrage, it's calculated disappointment. A look that says, "You let me down." A silence that weighs heavier than 1,000 accusations. And you, not wanting to seem selfish, fold all over again. That's where Machiavelli's ideas become liberating. He didn't suggest cruelty, but strategy. He saw people as individuals with a territory to protect. You can't live out in the open with no walls, thinking someone else's goodness will be enough to shield you. Your heart needs defense too. Because emotional damage doesn't always come from enemies. It often comes from the ones who claim to love us, but can't stop using us to fill their own emotional void. And yes, it's hard to accept. Hard to admit not all affection is healthy. Not all bonds are good for us. Even people who've been in our lives for years may have drained us more than they've stood by us. But freedom comes only when we're willing to see things without sugarcoating. When we dare to look not just at them, but at ourselves, at the parts of us that enable, that justify, that hold on just to avoid being labeled cold or disloyal. Protecting your energy doesn't mean shutting down your heart. It means learning how to use it wisely. It means no longer living at the mercy of other people's emotions. It means realizing you can care without absorbing, help without betraying yourself, love without allowing that love to be used against you. And that involves something many people find almost painful, learning to say no without an explanation. Because some folks have mastered emotional language to make you feel guilty every time you put yourself first. They can't handle your distance. Their power depended on your constant availability. They can't bear your silence. Their control fed off your reactions. Deep down, they didn't want you strong. They wanted you accessible. Machiavelli saw it coming. If you don't command respect, you'll be reduced to a useful tool. Maybe not through violence, but through endless expectations, demands dressed up as concern, a constant need for validation. And when that happens, you don't just get tired, you forget. You forget what you wanted, what you thought, what you needed. Because suddenly, everything revolves around them. Their wound, their story, their approval. But there's something quietly revolutionary in learning how to walk away. In not replying. In not getting dragged into the same old emotional tug-of-war. In no longer explaining every boundary or justifying every absence. Not every connection deserves a goodbye. Some just need to be left with the dignity of someone who finally understands that energy is life and it should never be given away out of pity. Maybe that's why it's so hard to find emotional rest these days. Because we're not just surrounded by people, we're surrounded by hidden needs, emotional demands dressed up as love. And if you don't learn to tell the difference, you end up a prisoner of every story you hear, of every feeling someone else refuses to handle on their own. That's why silence matters. Not silence as neglect, but as power, as protection, as clarity. If you don't know how to stay quiet, you'll keep reacting to everything. And in that flood of reactions, you'll lose yourself. Emotional manipulation feeds on noise, explanations, defensiveness, chaos. But when you respond with calm that doesn't plead, with distance that doesn't apologize, something in the dynamic breaks. The other person senses, without words, that the gate is closed, the access denied. And in that simple gesture, you begin to reclaim yourself. Not overnight, but with quiet certainty. Because every time you choose yourself, even if someone else calls it selfish, something inside you begins to realign. Your body breathes differently. Your mind clears. Your heart beats without fear. Because there's no longer a threat disguised as love. No longer a demand dressed as need. In that moment, you stop being a victim of other people's feelings and start becoming the author of your own peace. Not from coldness, but from awareness. From the understanding that not everything that hurts is worth it. That not every wounded soul has the right to wound you. That not every bond is love. And maybe, just maybe, when you look back, you'll be able to see how much energy was lost trying to hold together what was always falling apart. How many times you gave up peace just to keep the illusion of harmony. How often you swallowed your truth just to avoid making waves. But you'll also see, with relief, that all of it taught you what you'll never allow again. What you no longer trade. What you now guard like a treasure, your strength, your clarity, your peace. That, in the end, is power too. The power of not needing anyone's permission to protect yourself. The power of walking away without guilt. The power of choosing yourself. No explanations needed. And then comes that moment, quiet, heavy, undeniable, when, after seeing with painful clarity what you once mistook for love, you sit alone with yourself and finally understand. Protecting your energy isn't an act of defense against the world, it's a return home. Not to a place, but to that inner home you've abandoned too many times while holding up someone else's roof, putting out fires that weren't yours, standing in storms you never started. And when that realization finally sinks in, something breaks, yes, but something else starts to rebuild. Something that refuses, from this point on, to be violated again. Because looking emotional manipulation in the eye also means facing your own cracks. It means admitting that, more often than not, you didn't cling to that person out of love, but out of fear. Fear of not being good enough if you walked away. Fear of being called heartless if you set boundaries. Fear of being alone if you shut the door. But all of that is just the shadow of an ego that still hasn't learned to trust its own strength. And the manipulator, whether they know it or not, can sense that. They smell the doubt, spot the wound, and that's where they build their story, that if you leave, you're the villain. That if you take care of yourself, you're selfish. That if you stop responding, it means you never cared. And that's how guilt moves in. That's how peace gets stolen. And yet, there is something deeply healing about crossing that line. About defying that emotional sacrifice we were taught to believe was virtue. About looking at the person who made you feel small, guilty, and responsible for their instability, and not flinching. Not reacting. Not explaining. Just standing tall. Eyes clear. Soul quiet. Like someone who finally understands that they don't need the other person to get it anymore. Because the truth is, they probably won't. They won't see the manipulation. They won't own their role in your exhaustion. They might even present themselves to the world as victims of your coldness, your distance, your sudden change. And you'll have to hold your ground through that narrative too. You'll have to keep your decision without applause, without witnesses, without medals. Just you, your clean conscience, and the pieces of your energy you've finally gathered back. And that, more than anyone ever says, is hard. Because freedom costs. Because choosing yourself often means disappointing those who only loved you when you were easier to control. But that's exactly where Machiavelli's quiet wisdom hits hardest. Virtue isn't about pleasing others, it's about holding your own standard, even when that makes people uncomfortable. Real power doesn't come from begging for love, chasing approval, or trading your peace for company. Real power is lived. And once it's lived, it quietly starts to filter who's allowed into your life and who no longer gets access. And maybe that's why, in protecting your energy, you don't become colder, you become warmer toward yourself. You stop craving validation. Silence, once unbearable, becomes an ally. Loneliness doesn't scare you anymore, because now it's filled not with guilt or shame, but with a steady presence. A gentle voice inside that says, "You're doing the right thing, even if no one else understands." And sometimes, just sometimes, that inner shift becomes visible on the outside too. Some people walk away. Of course they do. They walk away because they can't manipulate you anymore. Because you stopped playing your part in their drama. But others come in. People who don't relate through demand, but through respect. People who don't need to control, but simply want to share. And that's when you understand. The cost of walking away from what drains you is the exact same cost that opens the door to what heals you. There's no perfect roadmap for this. No one-size-fits-all formula. Every connection has its own traps, its own gray areas. But one thing never changes, the feeling in your body when something's wrong. That heaviness when you're with someone who says they love you, but leaves you drained. That tightness in your chest when you try to talk, but everything becomes a scene. That chill under your skin when, even surrounded by people, you realize you've disappeared. Listening to those signals is wisdom. It's your compass, and it doesn't lie. And even when we know what's happening to us, it's still hard to act. Because cutting a bond, even a toxic one, hurts. There's history, there's affection, there are memories. But over time, with scars and healing, you learn, not every story deserves to last forever. Not everything that mattered once still deserves space now. And sometimes, most times, growth looks like letting go. And here's the paradox. The more you protect yourself, the more open you are to real love. Not the love that demands, but the love that stands beside you. Not the love that consumes, but the love that cares. Because only when you're full inside can you give without disappearing. Only when you've stopped justifying your peace can you open your heart without letting it get invaded. Machiavelli whispers it, if we're willing to hear him. Those who don't know how to stand their ground will always be pawns in someone else's game. Emotional manipulation is just misused power. A game where one rules through guilt and the other obeys through sacrifice. Breaking out of that doesn't require cruelty, it requires clarity. Yes, sometimes even coldness. But not the kind that destroys. The kind that saves. It's the coldness of a surgeon who knows where to cut. Of a strategist who knows when to walk away. Of a human being who's finally realized they weren't born to carry everyone else's emotional emptiness. Who no longer feels obligated to save those who refuse to save themselves. Who sees that their energy, their attention, their time aren't freebies. They're sacred, and they deserve to be guarded like a kingdom. And so, without fireworks or long speeches, you learn to live differently. To choose your circle more wisely. To love yourself in a less romantic, but much more real way. To look back with gratitude, but also with resolve. Because every time you fall into emotional manipulation and manage to crawl your way out, something in